Well, I want to thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me here. And I want to in particular thank all of you for taking time from, yet another glorious Vermont day to come and dedicate yourselves to thinking about building community resilience and climate action, two of the most important topics that I can think of. And it is tough on these beautiful days, right? Because don't you all feel a little guilty that it's still so that we get to enjoy, like, we know it's climate change, right? and yet it's delicious. We still have, it's like enough already with the string beans in the garden. Like, it should be done by now. And we've got a second set of peas that just seeded themselves. And we're going to go to the garden tomorrow and see what else is there. And it's a complicated time. It really is a complicated time. In my sitting with Fran, we were talking about what gives us hope, but the starting point is what doesn't give us hope. And how many of you have a hard time like listening to the news? It's just overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And I had thought in advance of how I would get us started in this conversation about the important role we all play in this room for advancing climate solutions and building resilience in the communities where we live and with the people that we love. But the starting point is remembering how blessed we are. Right? That's really got to be the starting point. And I think in Vermont we're particularly blessed. I mean, how many of you share the experience? And we started talking about this in order to brainwash our children to come back to Vermont after they were adults. But but it's true. Every time you drive across the border, isn't there an exhale? Isn't it like, oh, Vermont is so beautiful over here, and like, how different really can it be than New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York? Like, how? But it does feel different, doesn't it? Viscerally feel different when you cross over. I see a lot of nods, and when I think, I right now I'm teaching part-time up at UVM, and every day I take the bus, which is wonderful because you sit really high, and you can see it's this every day it's an extraordinary drive. Every single day you can see the mist rising through the mountains and see, even as it's becoming stick season, it's extraordinary every day, and the blue sky, the clouds, the folds in the landscape. I mean, we are really blessed here. We're blessed in that we really have community too, right? There's a lot of places in the world where people feel isolated. They don't have that sense of connection to each other. And so one of the themes that I want to talk about today, and so keep in your mind, is connection, that sense of connection. And it's a great theme of the day, which is this: how do we build resilience? And this is an interesting part of the state to be talking about it, because as you may remember, when Tropical Storm Irene came through, because of the steepness of these valleys and how the rivers follow the roads, a lot of this area was completely wiped out. There were, if you were driving from the north or you were driving from the east, you couldn't have gotten here after Irene because all of the east-west roads were destroyed. They were gone. And as Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, I was brand new then. It was 7 months into my term there, and I really got to see firsthand what made for resilient communities and what didn't. And it was about connection. And in Vermont, we know that one of the things that we're lucky about is we do have. How many of you know what our state motto is? Anyone want to shout it out?
Freedom and unity.
It's freedom and unity, right? Not live free or die, right? It's freedom and unity. Part of our fundamental values as Vermonters, our identity as Vermonters, is we like our individual freedom. We're a little libertarian. Don't tell us what to do, but we believe in the power of community, that we thrive when we do it together. And after Irene, I saw this in action firsthand. I saw communities that came together. They didn't wait for us in the state to get there, right? For better or for worse, right? They had in some cases, they dug up rivers and did terrible damage, but the intention was good, right? They had equipment in their sheds and they were going to use it to help their neighbors. And then I saw some communities that really didn't do well, that never got off the duff and never figured out how to take care of themselves, and those were communities that really didn't have connection to each other. There, in a couple of the cases, there was a divide in a cultural divide in the community of the newcomers and the oldcomers, and there hadn't been leadership. There hadn't been something that drew people together to feel connected to each other, and it mattered. In recovery, it mattered. There are communities that bounce back better than they were before. If you go to how many of you have been to Waterbury lately? Right, completely destroyed, and now it's this incredible hub. It's the beer hub. If you haven't been there, it's because you don't drink beer, probably. But it's like the beer central of Vermont, and it is full. It's hard to park, and all the cars have license plates from all over. It's not Vermont license plate, so it's become this revived center in a way that really shows the resilient power of that community to bounce back after disaster and become better than they were before. So there's a couple things I want to talk with you about resilience. And one is what we can learn from nature about resilience. And I have to say, I for my introduction, in my bio, I forgot to mention that I'm a trustee of the Nature Conservancy, and I have to tell you, that's one of the best things I've ever done. And after I left public office, I instantly got invited to join a ton of boards, and I didn't, with the exception of this one. And that's because what they do is they think about the power of nature, and the power of nature to help protect communities, the power of nature to clean our water. They think about how we live with nature and our obligation, therefore, to protect nature. And they do a great job with it. And one of the things that they keep in mind, and at the Agency of Natural Resources we did as well, is that nature also needs resilience. And like human communities and individuals and families, nature will be more resilient, we've observed, when it's connected to intact ecosystems. When an ecosystem is connected to another ecosystem, which is connected to another ecosystem. And so when we're doing planning in Vermont, resilience planning, and we did a lot of this at the Agency of Natural Resources, we actually have maps that show how the landscape connects. And one of the things that you may not know we're particularly blessed by in Vermont, and it's part of why when we go outside we can feel it viscerally, is that we have geology, that our bedrock, our geology is such that our soils allow for a lot of different kinds of ecosystems. And it's unique. It's actually different than New Hampshire. New Hampshire's granite-based, we're limestone-based, but we've got, I think it's called calcareous soils. And those soils support a whole host of different kinds of ecosystems. And if you think more like in geologic time rather than in human time, and you think about the migration of species, right? With climate change, we don't know what's going to happen next, right? So the best thing we can do right now as human beings is make sure that there's a connected landscape, so that as there's a migration of species, they'll have the best chance of survival, right? Because in this room, we all understand the importance of biodiversity and protecting nature. Even if we don't know why we're protecting a particular species, we know there's value, right? And we know that there's this law of unintended consequences. And when we lost 90% of our bats not surprising, all of a sudden we have equine encephalitis, right? A mosquito-borne disease that hadn't been here before, right? There are consequences, and we won't know what they are until it's too late. So when we think about climate resilience in Vermont, we have these great scientific tools to help us show that connection in the landscape. And so when we're talking about migration of species, we're also not talking about the moose walking north. We're talking about trees, right? As we know our climate changes, we want to make sure that trees and plants and the bugs can do what they need to on the landscape to survive by that connection. The same thing, this idea of connection applies also to human resilience. One of the things psychologists have observed is, there's been long the question is, why can you get two people who have the same terrible childhood, and one does great and the other doesn't? Or two families that have suffered from similar kinds of terrible disasters, and one bounces back and the other doesn't. And very often it's because it's whether or not they feel connected to something larger than themselves, that they have a community there to support them, that there are other people that they can rely on for help. That makes all the difference. And so let me bring that back to you for a second. When we think about the role of faith-based communities in this conversation about resilience, let's put aside for a minute climate resilience and just think about people for a second. It's often, these psychologists have found that what makes or breaks somebody's success often relates to whether they're connected to a religious community. That religious communities, because it builds that connection, offers a kind of resilience, human resilience, that you don't get in other places. Now in Vermont, we get it from town meeting in some cases, right? That we have this other connection to each other in a civic way. But in most places in the country, there's isolation. People don't have that connection to a community. So let me take connection one step further and think about how we move to action. So I would bet that every one of you in this room feels truly connected to nature in some way. Would you say? I mean, when you go into the woods, or if you happen to live in a rural area, if you even just look out your back window and sort of watch the fox that's crawling across the field and going back into the woods, or if you're a hiker and you go to the top of a mountain and get that feeling of expansiveness in the world, or you just are taking a walk in the forest and you smell that forest stuff, that rich, deep, earthy smell, right? That gives you a sense of connection to something larger than yourself and a sense of peace. And back to research and psychologists, there was actually just a study that came out of, I think, Stanford, that talked about how that experience in nature actually makes you more resilient from a mental health perspective. It also helps with cognitive ability. So, as a person's aging, the more they're in nature, the more they're experiencing the wonder of the world, walking in nature, the better their mind is going to be over time, the better their mental health is going to be. And of course, we all know the physical benefits of getting outside and being active and really breathing the air. And so back to human resilience, there's this connection to nature. And if you think about, spirituality, and thinking about where we find our spiritual homes. I would bet that many of you in this room find a spiritual home, perhaps in your community of faith, in a church or meeting or synagogue or a temple, but you also find it out in nature. And I think that is, when you think about your blessings and what you have to offer the world, when you think about how you take what you're learning here today out to the world to build resilience, you have to keep that in mind. That you're here perhaps because you understand what's at stake, not intellectually, but you understand it from a place of spirit. That there's a saying that I use in a lot of my talks that apply here too, which is that we only protect the things we love, and we only love the things we know. And so getting people outdoors is probably the first step in building a resilient community, if we're thinking about climate resilience. And if we're thinking about resilience in terms of helping people feel connected to something larger than themselves, so when adversity happens, they can bounce back. So, number one, getting people out into nature. And making sure you feed yourself by getting out into nature. And actually what was interesting about the study is that it wasn't just, you got a lot of the benefit just from looking at nature. Like you didn't actually, like if you are not able to actually take a hike to the top of a mountain or take a walk in the woods, but just viewing that pastoral setting, viewing nature gives you a lot of the benefits. Just feeling that connection, however it is. So let me talking about that. So the other piece of research that I wanted to talk to you about today was to start your thinking for this whole day of workshops is what your role can be in your communities and the power of your leadership. One of the things that we've learned when we study how people make decisions and how people develop their attitudes about things like climate change, but other things as well, is that it has less to do with facts. I mean, how many of you have ever had an argument with somebody who was arguing that climate change really wasn't real? And it really did not matter what you said. Right? Right? Did anyone actually ever persuade somebody with scientific facts? Anyone here in this room? Yeah, okay.
Well, it's all based on hypotheses, and they have to convince you that the hypotheses are reasonable.
That's right. It's like right, there's no, facts do not convince, generally, and in specific with climate change. People make decisions based on their identity. Have you heard this before? Mm-hmm. Some of you have, right? And that's because this is emerging, there's emerging science around this, and that it's based on identity, and there's good news and bad news with that. So if you think about the change in attitudes around climate change, and that happened over the course of the second term of Obama's presidency. So, Obama we're a very divided country. It didn't just start with Trump. It happened during the Obama administration as well, and actually predated that with the Bush, election, and very divided country. And one of the things that research showed, and if you haven't seen it, you can go to, it's the Yale School of Climate Communication that I like to go to and look at their research and what they extrapolate from it. But they've been, for a long time now, trying to see how people make decisions and what their attitudes are about climate change and action to stem climate change. And one of the things that we saw is over the course of that second term, when the president was talking about climate change all the time, and many of his top cabinet members were talking about climate change regularly, people's attitudes about climate change changed. And it was, it defied partisanship. So it wasn't, it changed across the board, although not, at a similar rate, although the folks who identified themselves as Republicans or conservatives changed less, but there was a change there as well in people believing that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's significantly caused by human activity. So that was really hopeful. And my theory, and this is simply my theory, is that it's because when we think about our identities, many of us count as an important identity that we're Americans. And as the leader of the country, whether or not you liked him or not, you have a president. And that there is a very subtle way that that influences your view on the world. If you have the leader of the group you identify with talking about climate change, then it comes with an authority that is persuasive in that non-logical way, right? Because we agree that it's not about facts, it's about identity. So it's back to this, it's not based on a logical persuasion. So you can tell what the danger is now, right? So the danger is that now we've got a president and everyone he's appointed are climate deniers to some degree or another. And so as a result, you're hearing less about it and more questions about it. And what that means is that it's going to be very, very important for people like you, for people who are leaders in their communities in some way, to step up and really talk about climate change. Because you need to have other leading voices to counterbalance the messages that are coming from the top. And I would say that faith-based communities are more important now than ever. When you have a pope, the pope talking about climate change and issuing this encyclical and asking all of the churches to act on it and to make that part of what happens day to day. That, for folks whose identity is I'm Catholic, that will make a difference, right? That can be meaningful. Now, we do know in the United States, there's a lot of places where you've got Catholics where their primary identity is not that they're Catholic. Their primary identity might be that they're conservative, or they're an American, or that something else. But the more of these alternative leaders that are stepping up, talking about climate change, the better chance we'll have to stay on track, okay, in really doing something about it. So when you think about Vermont then, and how blessed we are here in Vermont, part of our identity as Vermonters is that we're the Green Mountain State. We're green. And Vermonters, more than any place except Alaska, get outside. So we are outside. And actually, Vermonters, more than any place in the country, believe that nature is worth protecting. I mean, there was a study that, our Fish and Wildlife Division that does these regular studies about opinions about a whole bunch of things relating to protecting nature and conservation. And one of the really surprising findings, I thought, from the last survey that they do it every 5 years, and so the last one came out about a year ago, was that Vermonters overwhelmingly believed that they personally would give up some of their rights to do whatever they want with their property to protect an ecosystem. Right? Not to protect their hunting grounds, not to protect water plot, but to protect just generally, to protect biodiversity. And they didn't say it said, it had different words for it, but that's remarkable, to live in a place where people understand the importance of protecting nature. That people really, it's a land-based economy. People understand that our ability to thrive and in the future and survive into the future is directly related to how we protect nature in our communities. So for us in Vermont, that's a great starting point. On the other hand, we're still addicted to fossil fuel here in Vermont, right? The best of us. We still are heating our homes by and large with oil, and we're still having to drive everywhere, and we're getting some electric vehicles on the road, but we still have people in our communities actively fighting renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind and hydro's complicated, I have to say, because of the Clean Water Act. We can talk about that if you want. But in any event, even in the greenest place in the country, we still have a lot of work to do if we're going to fight climate change and do our part. And how many of you, when you're talking to folks about climate change and doing something about it, get the response, well, we're Vermont. we're so little. I mean, really? Like, will this solar thing make, like, why would we destroy our field because, it's really China, until China and India do something, it won't make a difference, right? Do you get that? Yeah. And the answer, I mean, there's of course an ethical answer to that, which is that and a practical answer, right? Which is that we're all like those drops of rain that individually, it's just kind of soft and wet, but together like created the Grand Canyon, right? We can't, and if we say, well, not us, then we're part of the problem. And we really have this moral obligation to be part of the solution. So there's that. But the truth is, because we're a small place that has the blessing of being filled with people who've got this environmental ethic, we can do more, and we can demonstrate to our neighbors across the country and across the world how you can really transform, so that you can transform how you live on the land, how you live in communities, so that we can help the planet be sustainable into the future. And that we one of the, it was mentioned that I was in Morocco and Paris at the climate summits, and a lot of what I did is I talked about what we were doing in Vermont, how we were really deploying renewable energy at scale in a way that was actually starting to make a difference, and how we were planning for transportation, which for us in Vermont is going to be very complicated, right, because we're a rural state. How we're rethinking agriculture, both for resilience and also for carbon, and how we're looking for co-benefits, the places where we can make our communities more livable, and drive economic development at the same time as we're reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and reducing our climate emissions. So that's really what can be our role, is the catalyst for innovation. And it starts in community, and it starts with people like you, people who are really committed and really want to make a difference, who are influencers, who come with a sense of how we're connected to each other. And I guess, so my final point here is each one of you here has power to make change. Each one of you has the seed in you to help catalyze changes that will make a real difference if you choose to take it. And it's hard work, right? It's because sometimes it feels so small, like, do we need a town energy committee, and what are we going to do? Let's get people to change light bulbs, but what does that really do, and how much effort, and what? But the key is each of you in your communities can think about how to make a difference and be that leader who continues to talk about climate change, who continues to ensure that our legislators, we've got Robin here, who I worked with when he was when I was secretary he's on the energy committee, right, still, good. And I didn't know if they moved, I know they moved people around this time, right? And so he's, you can go and lobby him and make sure that we've got the policies in place that are going to keep us on the right path here in Vermont. And you can pay attention to the world and keep the pressure on so that we're heading in the right direction. So I want to leave enough time for questions, because I thought that you might have some, given that, I've engaged in this on a number of different levels. But before I do that, I just want to do a shout out to my husband, who's in the back here, Paul Markowitz, because during the introduction was about, how much, I've committed myself to environmentalism, and in fact, we're a total team here. And one of our proudest moments, I would say, speaking for both of us, was when our children, our oldest daughter, was first looking at colleges. They're all grown up now. We're empty nesting, and she would strike colleges off her list because they didn't compost. And she couldn't imagine going to a place that didn't compost, because it just wasn't going to be a thing. And then, so there you go. Yes, Spencer.
I really like your message that community helps us react better to crisis and be more resilient. I think one of the challenges we have with the climate crisis is that many people don't view it as a crisis. So it's easy to respond to a crisis if you view it as a crisis. But how can we turn that sense of community into something that is a train wreck waiting to help happen that many people don't recognize as a train wreck?
So we know that actually, responding to a crisis that's happened does galvanize people. But one of the things that we know is that the talk of doom and gloom actually keeps people from acting. And so the more we talk about how this is it, the ice caps and how it's all downhill and there's nothing we can do, it becomes so big that people can't move forward. And when Fran and I were talking about hope, what resonated with me was this idea that fundamentally we need to bring optimism to the conversation, right? And the way I do it, because I couldn't have been in public service for so long without being fundamentally optimistic and fundamentally a believer in human resilience and the human spirit. And part of my trick is I do try sometimes step back and try to think in large, I think like in 100 years, when they look back at this period in time, what will they say? And there will be change, and there will be disasters that hurt people, and we're seeing it already with, Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands and on, and we will see it, and it'll get harder and harder for us. So first of all, we need to continue to take care of ourselves and get out into nature and really make sure we can be personally resilient. But we can also be the visionaries that say, we don't have to convince you that it's coming and it's a disaster and we're doomed. But really what we could be doing is thinking about how do we make it as easy for people to make a good choice as it is the bad choices. Like, how do we think about, it's, like, for example, they're doing great work now with putting in bike lanes. And what that does is it makes it easier to make the choice of riding a bicycle. Like, there are a lot of places I wouldn't have gone by bike because I wouldn't go on the Barry Montpelier Road on bike. That's like, there's nothing fun about that, right? But there's a way to build the bike lanes to make it feel like, oh, this is awesome, I can do it. I mean, they're doing it places. So how do we make choices, policy choices? How do we make investments? How do we build our communities in a way that enables us to make the right choice? And so, for example, universal recycling. Do you all know about the universal recycling law? And do you all know how audacious that law is? Right? Its goal is to ban organics from the landfill. And that is audacious. And the way you do that, the way you make it possible for people to make the choice to not put organics into their garbage is to make it just as easy to separate the organics and get it taken away and managed as it is to get their trash taken away and managed. You succeed in your recycling rates if you make it just as easy to recycle as it is to toss, right? And that creates culture change. Another question? Yes.
So thank you so much. I was interested in the study that said that spiritual growth happens by being in nature, or even looking at images of nature. Was that a particular study, or is that like a group of studies?
There's a group of studies. The most recent study, I believe, came out of Stanford, but feel free to contact me at my office. It's deborah.markowitz@uvm.edu, and I'll see if I can pull them out for you.
Great, thank you.
When I give talks, my goal is to, like, I'm remembering that but I don't have it written down. So, but feel free to call and I'll find it for you. Yeah. It's the middle age thing. It's like if you get too caught up on the numbers and then you're not going to really communicate well. So, yes.
So this is just a comment about when people say, well, what difference does it make, you know, I carry my own napkin, bags, utensils wherever I go, and I think the answer is that my particular action is not going to save the world. But every time I take out the bag or the napkin, I'm reminded of my connection to Earth. It transforms me, and then I feel free to talk about it with other people. So I do, like, when I'm traveling and people want to give you all those paper napkins and everything, and they take it out and they go, oh, that's so cool, what a good idea, you know, so and then it spreads.
Yeah.
But it's that connection, I think, that's so important, and thank you so much, because that's just what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Yes.
I enjoyed your, when you spoke about the Harvard study about identity, and that's how people make their decisions, which was really interesting. And there's a lot of people in this country, we can agree, the climate change deniers that don't identify with climate change, don't identify with most of what we do here, the values of recycling and nature conservancy. But now that we know that people make these decisions on identity, and climate change is so broad and far-reaching, and it affects us on a local level and national scale, how would you recommend that we communicate with people that don't identify with climate change and environmentalists?
Well, so I have two different recommendations, right? So day to day, there's a lot of what needs to be accomplished that can be talked about not as climate change, but energy independence. And always when you're talking to somebody, it's important that you understand that it's about them, and you start where they are. So that's that. You know, I'm in a number of national conversations about this, and I personally resisted this idea that you know we can accomplish the same goals without talking about climate change and without entering into that debate, so that they don't get stuck into, you know, the identity politics. And there's a lot of virtue to that. And I realized after I stopped being secretary that in part my resistance was, I think it's important still for secretaries, for people in visible leadership positions, to talk about climate change because of this, because of identity politics. So you have to have both things going on at the same time. I think in communities, you know, you need to think about where are the people that you're talking to, where are they coming from. And I just did a report for the Georgetown Climate Center on climate smart agriculture. And you know, one of the things that one of the things that's happening nationally is there's a real focus on how do we eat, how do we grow food, and what its contribution is to climate change, and how do we transform that. And there's a tremendous opportunity when it comes to agriculture, because not only does agriculture produce climate gases, methane and carbon, and if you don't do it right, especially, you know, it can be very damaging to climate change. But good farming practices or different farming practices can actually be climate beneficial, right? You can end up capturing carbon, sequestering carbon, and those same practices also build climate resilience. So you get a threefer by focusing on agriculture and agricultural practices. Very often, though, when you're talking to farmers, what they care about is they're trying to make a living, right? And so how do you start where they are and get where you want to go? Well, you don't start by talking about climate change. You talk about how you protect your farms from floods and storms. You talk about, you know, how do you lower your energy costs? How do you change your practices so that you have greater production and efficiency. You don't talk about climate change, and there's a way, and that's quite possible. On the other hand, it would be great if the Secretary of Agriculture could talk about climate change. And you know, so I hold both of those truths, right? Yes, Fran.
I want to reinforce what you just said about starting where people are. And since Paul is in the back here, he'll appreciate this.
You mean my Paul?
Your Paul, yeah. My energy Vermont Energy Challenge, where we were weatherizing homes. And there was a lot of discussion, and I know that Efficiency Vermont thought about this, like how do you get people to listen? And so what they came up with, and what we used very effectively, was trying to get people to insulate their homes, make them
Warmer.
button them up.
Right.
Yes. And so the message was save money, make your home more comfortable, and save energy.
Right.
And so that hit everybody, because most people want to save money. Who doesn't want to live in a comfortable home? And then the third part, save energy, is for those people who are tuned into climate change. But you don't hit them with that first.
That's right.
And that was actually very effective. And in my town now, I'm not known as the, like that annoying Democrat who's always going around trying to get people to vote. Now it's more like they don't.
Which you are.
Which I But
You should be proud of that.
They also see me as the person who helps them
Save money
save
and-
money and
yeah.
so on. And that is actually a relief to me that it's not partisan,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be.
Right, that's true, that's true. And one of the things that we've learned over time is that what moves people to action is personal stories. And all of you have personal stories. And, whatever it is. And we saw it with our neighbor. We had a neighbor, we live in a part of Montpelier where the houses are 100+ years old, which means that energy is, of course, always a problem, and they're pretty big. And our across the street neighbor had an energy audit done years before and just hadn't done anything about it until we told him how much money we were saving. And he sheepishly admitted what he was paying for in his oil bill, and all of a sudden that was what did it. It's like, okay, I guess we'll bite the bullet and make the investment. And it took him 7 years, 6 years? It was too much, too long. But it took that personal story. The math, again, the facts didn't matter. Seeing it, Actually, I remember, how many of you ever had a Volvo? Years ago. So this was when I was in college. This is my first experience with persuasion and studies about persuasion. There was a study done, I think at Harvard, looking at how people would make decisions about buying cars. And it was at a time when Volvo was like the safe car, the family car, the one that was, in an accident, it was going to survive, right? It was like the tank car. And so they found people who were looking for safe family cars, and they did a control group, and with one part, so the group they were experimenting on, they showed them a video of somebody saying, "Oh, I bought a Volvo and it was a lemon." And then they showed them all the same research about how Volvo was the best car for what they were looking for, and none of the people who saw the lemon piece of data, that personal story, decided to get the Volvo, right? And it didn't matter that it was an aberration, right? That Consumer Reports still rated Volvo the best, most reliable, that one lemon just wiped out all those facts. Right? So, that is human nature. Like, we know that to be so. So how much more time do I have? A little bit more?
Well, we started late, so let's take 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, and then I want to end with something from the Jewish tradition. Yes?
Okay. I am taking in everything that you're saying about how to communicate with people. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I'm on a fundraising committee, something completely separate to climate action, where the leader of the group is the local gas distributor.
Yes.
And we see eye to eye, we've never had any quarrels or anything, but I'm thinking if I wanted to start talking about climate action in that particular group, then they are going to be put out of work, in my feeling, because we want to keep fossil fuels on the ground. So how is she going to take that? How do you communicate with somebody who's actually running the fossil fuel company?
Well,
What do you do?
so one of the starting points is how much gas has made a difference in terms of slowing down climate pollution, right? So,
And it's not frack gas that they're selling, it's
and
natural.
whether it's frack gas or not, so because frack gas, depending on your practices, could be good or bad, but how you're doing it, whether or not you're burning off the methane and what you're doing with the water, the wastewater, and so forth. But so it's starting there about how much they're contributing to this immediate need to slow down our emissions, and that's where I would start with the positive. You start with the 30,000 foot and the positive, what you have in common, and then once there's trust, there's this conversation that about, well, how do you transition, right? There may be a time when we need to keep the rest of it in the ground. So how's your company transitioning? And I think it's no surprise that some of the biggest owners of renewable energy at scale are oil and gas companies. They're diversifying. That's what a smart company does. And so that, they know how to sell energy. And so now instead of it being extracted energy, it's wind energy. And there's a lot that's positive. And should I talk for 1 second about, even though, just leave you on a positive note, which is that even though you've got, it was in the news that Pruitt's, finally filed the revocation of the Clean Power Plan. You know why that's irrelevant, right? That's completely irrelevant, and how we're okay, and that with respect to our obligations under Paris, we're really on track, and I should have started there. I apologize. So, it's the president has a bunch of power, and it's leadership power. It's the power to be persuasive and to make something a priority or not. But there are other, in our society, there are other things that we know have even more power, and that's the power of the markets. And markets have changed. The energy markets have changed. So right now, because of natural gas, coal power plants are closing. Now, you did have the Energy Secretary, Perry, say, he has this scheme to subsidize coal, and that truly could be a problem. That could make a difference and actually keep coal plants open. It's just unlikely to happen, because a subsidy for coal is going to really make the natural gas folks, who are very powerful right now, really upset. And that's the Koch brothers, right? They're doing natural gas, they're doing oil, and so my guess is it's not going to happen. But here's an example of the market. In the Plain States, so this is northern Texas and in particular, wind power is so efficient and effective that it is selling at $20, I think, a kilowatt hour, I think is what it is, versus coal, which is $30. Right? Megawatt, yeah, not kilowatt, that's too small, right, the megawatt. I saw Paul saying, back there, he was like, no, you got the, but see how I middle-aged, I just fudged the, megawatt, because I know somebody's gonna correct me. But the 20 and 30 is not fun. So it's a $10 difference. Right? That is a change in the market that no president is changing. It's not surprising that the largest coal-powered plants are closing down. And this is why. Presidents come and go, and all those coal-powered plants are old. They're aged. They were all built around the same time. They're aging out, and in order to make them last, they have to invest tens of millions of dollars in refurbishing them. And who's going to do that, really? So we've got a crazy president who's here for 4 years, maybe 8 years, but I know. I'm talking about the market, right? I don't want to break your heart. Talking about the market. I can't break it. Okay, let's all spit over our shoulders. Right. So, but they're building plants that are going to be there 60 years, right? Why would you invest in a plant, in a technology that is no longer economic, and that is on the wrong side of history, right? It's just not going to be. So that's why, when you think about our obligations under Paris, it doesn't really matter what the Clean Power Plan, if it's there or not there. States are already on track with renewable portfolio standards, renewable energy standards, to meet their obligations. Not every one, but about half of them are already on track to meet their obligations. The place of challenge is the transportation sector, right? And moving away from the clean car standards. But because of federalism, that great little 10th Amendment, which says, the states have an awful lot of power, right? Unless the Constitution specifically give it a particular area to the federal government that states reserve the power, we've got the ability of California. It's more complicated than that, but California has its own clean car standards that Vermont and another 11 states follow, and that's driving innovation. I mean, you've got, was it GM that announced they're coming out with, 7 new electric vehicles, including an SUV and a truck? I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And you've got other countries in Europe saying, hey, and China, that's saying we're going to be banning internal combustion engines over the next 20, 30 years. So that's going to drive innovation that'll change what happens in our communities. And in Vermont, we're going to be ready for it because we know we need to have the infrastructure for electric vehicles in place. So we're on track. Yes?
One question, a smaller one, well, maybe not. I feel a lot of personal pain when the debate comes up regarding aesthetics. The aesthetics of wind, or some damage involved, and the aesthetics of solar arrays. And people start with, I'm an environmentalist, but.
Right.
And I was hoping you could relieve some of our pain.
Yeah, so
how we might address that.
So I believe that this is a moral issue, right? And if you think about it for a minute with compassion, this is the first time in our modern history where we've had to take responsibility for the impacts of our energy, right? We've exported it. We've bought energy on the market that maybe it's come from Hydro-Quebec, where they flooded thousands of acres of native lands, right? There was an environmental impact, but we exported that. Or it came from coal or gas, where we have these terrible gas spills, and of course the mountains not just having a turbine on top, they disappear, right? They take down the mountain to get the coal, but we've exported that environmental impact. So the compassionate place to start is understanding this is different for us, to have to actually look in the face the fact that there is an environmental impact from whatever energy choice we make. Right, so that's number one. And just there's nothing that we do on the landscape that doesn't have an impact. But I feel morally bound to make sure that we're doing our part, even though it means taking some of the consequences. And there's ways to do it that are less impactful. So as secretary, I actually, not too far from here is a place called Grandpa's Knob. It was actually the place, the first wind turbine that was connected to an electric grid in the world, I believe, was there at Grandpa's Knob. Now, Grandpa's Knob also happens to be a very, very special place ecologically because it's where the Taconic Range meets the Green Mountain Range. And as a result, you've got natural communities you don't find anywhere else. And so when you look at our maps of special places to preserve, that's one of them. So when they were planning to put a wind farm there, we objected. And we said, no, you cannot mitigate the environmental impact. On the other hand, if you went up to Lowell and saw those wind turbines, it has a significant impact. I mean, it really, it's a significant development. And it's making a difference. It's really producing energy, and it's allowing us to not burn fossil fuels. And when you look at our maps, it's not in every place is special, right? Every mountaintop is special, but it's not in a place that's unique, where it says no, that's a pinch point of connectivity or that. And so we need to make distinctions, right? We need to say not everywhere, but somewhere. And it is legitimate. When Paul and I were driving down this morning, we saw a couple of solar developments that were just poorly done. They should have had screening. And it's part of the learning curve. This is new to us. This land use is new to us. And so it's part of the learning curve. So that's another piece of coming to it with compassion, to say, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's good ways to do it and there's poor ways to do it. But we have to do it. So that's fine. Let's figure out what the Vermont way is to do it. So let me end here with something that comes from my religious tradition, which is Judaism. And this is the fall, and this is when we have the New Year. And you've all heard about Rosh Hashanah, right, the Jewish New Year. But did you know that it's actually not the New Year? The New Year in the calendar, it moves around a little bit, but it's more closer to the spring. It really is the anniversary of creation. So in the Jewish tradition, every year we observe the anniversary of creation by rededicating ourselves to tikkun olam, which is a Hebrew word that means healing the rift. And it means to make the world a better place, make the world whole. So there are two different interpretations. One is this idea of making the world whole, or by bringing back together kind of the light and the dark. So making ourselves whole spiritually. And so when I think about my own environmental ethic, and actually my purpose in life, so when I think about, like, why am I here? It always comes back to this idea of tikkun olam. I'm here to heal the rifts in the world, to heal the world, to make the world a better place. And I have to say, what better way to do it than to really work to make the world like a better place. So I want to thank you all for your dedication to tikkun olam, whether you knew you were doing it or not. And I just wish you the best, and I'll be around if you want to talk and have questions.